Welcome to 80s horror stories, where the past does not stay buried, and some things were never meant to be seen. Tonight's story is not about a haunted house. It is about reflection, or more precisely, what happens when something that has never seen itself finally does. The house stood alone at the far edge of Black Ridge County, Ohio, a place where the land stretched too wide and the silence lingered too long. It wasn't abandoned, but it wasn't lived in either. It existed, in between. The locals never spoke about it directly. They didn't warn me not to go there. They simply avoided the subject, which, in my experience, is always worse. I arrived in the early winter of 1901, just as the fog began to settle low across the ground, clinging to the earth like something unwilling to let go. The letter that brought me there was brief. No name, no return address. Just a statement. The house is intact, but do not bring a mirror inside. At the time, it sounded absurd. A superstition. A warning rooted in old beliefs, and like most warnings that seem irrational, I ignored it. The house itself was large, though not grand in the way wealth announces itself. There was no elegance to it, no welcoming symmetry. Instead, it carried a quiet imbalance, something subtle enough to escape immediate notice, yet strong enough to unsettle the mind the longer one looked. Its architecture was strange, but not in any obvious or easily explained way. There were no twisted towers, no broken angles, nothing that could be pointed at and declared unnatural. And yet, the longer I stood before it, the more a quiet hesitation formed in my thoughts, as though the structure resisted being understood all at once. The windows were narrow. Too narrow. Not the kind designed for beauty or light, but for limitation. They allowed the outside world to be seen, but never fully. Like thin slits carved into something that preferred to observe rather than reveal. The walls appeared thicker than necessary. Not reinforced, not fortified, just excessive. As if the house had been built not merely to stand, but to contain. And the front door. It was heavier than it should have been, not just in weight, but in presence. When I placed my hand against it, there was a resistance, not physical, but perceptible, like pressing against something that had not been opened often, or perhaps was never meant to be opened easily at all. As if entry was allowed, but not encouraged. Inside, the air felt still, not stale, not decayed. Just, unmoving. It did not carry the scent of abandonment or neglect. Instead, it felt preserved, held in a state that had not progressed with time. Like the house existed in a moment that had simply refused to continue forward. Time had not stopped there, but it had slowed enough to feel unnatural. I stepped inside carefully, my boots echoing softly against the wooden floor, each step sounding slightly delayed, as if the sound followed me rather than accompanied me. The silence did not break, it adjusted. It made room for me, reluctantly, and that's when I noticed it. Not immediately, but gradually, as the absence became too consistent to ignore. There were no mirrors. Not in the entryway, where one would normally glance upon entering. Not in the sitting rooms, where light might have reflected and softened the space. Not above the fireplace, where such things are almost expected. Not even in the bedrooms. Every wall that should have held one was empty. At first, it felt like a design choice. Perhaps the previous owner had preferences. Some people avoided reflections, found them unnecessary. Then it felt intentional, deliberate, measured. Each absence too precise, too complete, to be coincidence. And then, it felt wrong, not missing, removed, as though mirrors had once existed here, and had been taken away, carefully, completely, for a reason that had not been left behind. I spent the first day exploring the house, moving slowly from room to room, attempting to understand a place that did not offer understanding easily. Yet with each step, a pattern revealed itself, not in what was present, but in how consistently everything felt restrained. Every room carried the same unsettling balance. Furniture was present, but minimal. Never enough to suggest comfort, only enough to suggest use. Chairs that faced away from windows. Tables placed slightly off-center. Nothing arranged for ease, only for function. Curtains were drawn, but never completely. They allowed light to enter, but only in fragments. Thin, controlled strips that never fully illuminated the space. The rooms were never dark, but they were never clear either. Everything existed in a state of partial visibility, filtered, restricted, as if the house did not want to be seen, only observed, in pieces. Upstairs, I found the bedrooms. Each one nearly identical to the last. Same dimensions, same arrangement. Same quiet emptiness that felt less like absence, and more like erasure. There were no personal belongings. No photographs. No portraits. No letters. It was not that the house had been abandoned. That would have been easier to accept. Easier to explain. Abandonment leaves behind traces, dust, decay, disorder, signs that something once existed and simply faded away. But this place carried none of that. It was not forgotten. It was cleared, deliberately, carefully, stripped of anything that might reflect who had once lived there. Not just objects, but presence. identity, evidence. Every surface felt as though it had been relieved of something essential, something that had been removed not in haste, but with intention. And standing in those rooms, surrounded by walls that held nothing and windows that revealed little, I began to feel it more clearly. Not understanding, not yet, but awareness. A quiet realization forming just beyond thought, pressing gently against the edges of my mind. This was not just a house without mirrors, it was a house without reflection. And without reflection, there could be no memory, nothing to confirm what was seen, nothing to preserve what had been. And without memory, something inside it could remain unseen, unrecognized, unchallenged. That thought lingered longer than it should have. It followed me as I moved through the rooms, as I traced the edges of empty walls, as I stood in spaces that felt occupied despite their emptiness. It stayed with me, even as evening began to fall. And perhaps that is why I ignored the warning, not because I dismissed it, but because a part of me needed to understand it. I should have listened. I know that now. But curiosity has a way of disguising itself as logic. It presents questions as necessities, and risks as opportunities. It convinces you that understanding is worth the cost, before you even realize there is one. So that evening, I brought the mirror inside. It wasn't anything unusual, just a small, handheld mirror I carried among my belongings. Plain, unremarkable, the kind of object no one gives a second thought to. But as I held it in my hand, standing in the center of that quiet, watchful room, it felt different. Out of place, like introducing a voice into a space that had been deliberately kept silent. I placed it carefully on the wooden table in the main room. The surface beneath it was smooth, untouched by time or use, as though it had been waiting for something to be placed there, though not this. I stepped back. And for a while, nothing happened. No sound. No shift. No reaction. Not even the faint settling of wood or the distant whisper of air moving through unseen cracks. The house did not respond to the mirror's presence, at least, not in any way I could immediately perceive. Just the same stillness that had greeted me when I first entered. Unbroken. Unchanged. And yet, not the same. Because now, it felt aware. Not alive in any obvious sense. Not moving, not breathing, but conscious in a way that resisted definition. Like a room that had been empty moments before, and now wasn't, though nothing visible had entered it. The silence no longer felt passive. It felt observant. As if something within the house had taken notice, and chosen not to react. Chosen, to wait. Night came slowly. Not like a curtain falling, but like a presence seeping in. It did not arrive from the sky alone, it seemed to rise from within the house itself. From the walls, from the floors, from the spaces between things. A gradual dimming that did not erase the light, but weakened it. The kind of night that does not arrive all at once, but spreads gradually, filling spaces in silence, settling into corners where light hesitates to remain. The house grew darker. But not entirely. It never allowed complete darkness. That was the first thing that felt deliberate. There was always just enough visibility to recognize shapes, but never enough to trust them. Edges softened. Corners deepened. Distances became uncertain. The space remained visible, but never clear. Only a dim, controlled presence of light, thin and fragile, like something being rationed rather than given freely. As if the house preferred to exist in a state where nothing could be seen, completely. The shadows did not spread naturally. They did not lengthen with the setting light or shift with any external source. They gathered, quietly, deliberately, pooling in corners as though drawn there by intention rather than darkness, stretching along the walls in uneven patterns that did not match the shape of the room, settling behind furniture as though they had chosen their positions, rather than fallen into them. They did not flicker. They did not waver. They remained, fixed, watching, not moving, but present, the kind of presence that does not announce itself, but becomes impossible to ignore once noticed. I found myself studying them longer than I should have, trying to understand their placement, their stillness, the way they seemed to hold their shape even when I shifted my position. There were moments, brief, uncertain, when it felt as though they adjusted, not enough to confirm, not enough to prove, but just enough to disturb. A slight difference, a subtle realignment, as if they were not reacting to the light, but to me. The silence deepened alongside them, not louder, not heavier, but more focused, like attention narrowing, like the house, whatever part of it had become aware, was no longer simply surrounding me, but observing me directly, measuring movement, noting hesitation, waiting for something I could not yet name. And in that dim, controlled stillness, with the shadows gathered and the air unmoving, the mirror resting just within reach no longer felt like an object. It felt like a disturbance. A change introduced into a place that had been carefully kept unchanged, something that did not belong, but had been allowed. For now. I sat near the table, the mirror resting just within my reach, close enough to use, far enough to ignore. At first, I avoided looking into it, not out of fear, not yet, but hesitation. A subtle resistance I could not fully explain. Something about the house made the idea of reflection feel intrusive, unwelcome, like I had brought something inside that did not belong there, something that disrupted the balance of a place that had long existed without it. As if the house had been built around the absence of reflection, and I had just undone that silence. Minutes passed, or perhaps longer. Time felt different there, slower, less defined. Eventually, I reached for the mirror. My hand moved carefully, almost unconsciously, as though I were trying not to disturb something by acknowledging it. I lifted it, held it steady, and looked. I saw myself. Nothing unusual, no distortion, no shadow, no presence, just my reflection staring back, tired, uneasy, human. And yet, even in that moment, something felt incomplete. Not wrong, but not entirely right either. As though the reflection existed, but the room behind it did not fully belong to it. As though I was seeing myself, but not seeing everything that was there. And that quiet, lingering discomfort did not leave. No objects that suggested identity, or memory, or life. Human. I almost laughed at the tension I had built in my own mind. But then, something shifted. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. So subtle that I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. But I saw it. My reflection did not move exactly when I did. It followed. A fraction of a second too late. I froze, staring into the mirror, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. A trick of the light. A delay in perception. A tired mind. But then I moved again. Slowly, carefully. And there it was. Again. A delay. Small, but real. I lowered the mirror immediately. My heart beating faster now. Not from fear, but from realization. Something in this house did not understand reflection. That night, I did not sleep, because sometime after midnight, I heard movement, not from outside, not from the walls, but from the room itself. Soft, subtle. Like something adjusting to a new presence. I reached for the mirror again. And this time, I hesitated longer. Before lifting it, before looking, before confirming what I already suspected. When I finally raised it, I was not alone. My reflection was there. But behind me, something stood. I turned instantly. Nothing. The room was empty, silent, still. Slowly, I looked back into the mirror. And there it was again. Closer now. Not clear, not defined, but present. A shape, standing just behind where I had been. Watching. I lowered the mirror again. My breathing uneven now. My thoughts struggling to keep pace with what I was experiencing. This was no longer curiosity. This was intrusion. The house had existed without mirrors for a reason. Because whatever was inside it had never been seen. And now, it could see itself. The following day, the house felt different. Not physically, but internally. As if something had shifted. Awakened. The shadows no longer stayed in corners. They stretched, moved slightly. Adjusted to my presence. I avoided the mirror at first. But avoidance does not erase awareness. Eventually, I looked again. This time, the reflection was clearer. The shape behind me had form. Not human, but not entirely unfamiliar either. Its proportions were wrong. Its posture unnatural. And its face was not a face. It didn't mimic me. It didn't react to me. It simply watched. Days passed. Or what felt like days. Time became difficult to measure. Because something had changed. Not in the house, but in perception. The more I used the mirror, the more it appeared. The clearer it became, the closer it stood. And then, it began to learn. At first, it mimicked movement. Poorly, delayed, incorrect. Then it improved. It began to move when I moved. Almost perfectly, almost. But there was always something slightly off. A hesitation. A difference. A wrongness that could not be ignored. And then one night, it moved. When I didn't. That's when I understood. It wasn't copying me. It was studying me. And now, it no longer needed me to move first. The mirror fell from my hand that night. Cracking slightly against the wooden floor. But not breaking. I didn't pick it up. Not immediately. But I could feel it. Even without looking. It was still there. Watching. Learning. Waiting. The house had never been haunted. It had been empty. Waiting for something to be introduced. Something reflective. Something that could show it. What it was. Or what it could become. The final night came without warning. No sound. No shift. No signal. Only a feeling. I picked up the mirror one last time. Slowly. Reluctantly. Knowing what I would see. And this time, it was no longer behind me. It was standing, in my place. Perfect. Still. Looking directly at me, through the mirror. And behind it, there was nothing. No room. No walls. No house. Just darkness. And then, it smiled. I dropped the mirror. This time, it shattered. But that didn't matter. Because now, I didn't need it to see. It was no longer in the reflection. It was here, in the house, with me. I left that night. I don't remember how. I don't remember when. Only that I made it out. But some things do not stay where they begin. Because even now, years later, I avoid mirrors. Not out of fear, but because sometimes, when I pass by one, I see something, standing exactly where I am supposed to be, perfect, still, watching, and waiting, for me to look long enough, to understand. This has been 18 IES horror stories, and remember, some things do not exist, until you give them away, to see themselves.